question was on God. So I was wondering if I can ask Alex, what is the Christian view of God?
Thank you, Indra, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion and this talk with Suresh and all of you. I want to say, first of all, that I hesitate to say that I can give the Christian view of God. I can't speak even for the Unitarian Christian view of God, certainly not the UCA or indeed anyone else. So this is my personal view based on my own understanding and my respectful understanding of other people's views. In about 3 minutes, one person once remarked that he believed in God, but didn't very much like the people who did. And this brings me back to something that a Unitarian minister called Philip Hewitt, who wrote many books on Unitarianism, said that we have many different concepts of God. There is a philosophical problem with the notion of God, that if God is an entity among other entities, then he is not the God, he, she, it is not the God of the philosophers, as we understand it. On the other hand, in Christian thought, God has a special relationship with Jesus, and traditional Christianity, as it's developed down the centuries, has said that Jesus is both human and literally divine. Unitarian Christians believe that Jesus may have had a special relationship with God, may have been a wonderful human being, but nonetheless was not God. There is a via media between this, namely that we all partake in the Spirit of God. And this is where I think there's a fruitful dialogue to be held with various people, including us, we Unitarians, namely that the Unitarian notion of the Spirit of God, which comes from the Transcendentalists and others among them, is something where we share in that sense, in the divine. We share in that divine sense. Just a couple of quotes from the Bible, one of which is in the stained glass windows at Harris Manchester College in Oxford, our college there. Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells within you? So we therefore can share in some sense in God, because to quote the Jewish scriptures, which are sometimes called by Christians the Old Testament, God made humankind in God's image, male and female. God created them. And so therefore we are in some sense divine, albeit we are not the same as the divine. We're not gods, and none of us have those attributes of gods, but we share in some sense in the divine. And so therefore we can see ourselves as being a part of the divine work in creation. A Unitarian minister who died a few years ago called Sidney Knight wrote some very interesting thoughts on the Holy Spirit in Unitarianism. And he pointed out that many of our hymns are based on this notion that the Spirit of God in some senses works within us, each one of us, and works in the creation. So that's a very quick introduction to a Christian notion of God. Finally, I'd want to say that for Unitarians, we differ enormously, and Christians differ on what exactly was Jesus' relationship to God. What they would have in common would be that in some sense, Jesus has a special relationship to God. As reflected in some of the scriptures, there's a famous verse in the Bible, I and the Father are one. Where some Christians, and I personally would be one of those, would say also is that is not an exclusive relationship with God, that we are all capable of having a relationship with God, even if we really think that Jesus had a special relationship with God. So it's a very quick introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In the 3-minute timetable there. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And now I'll turn to Suresh. Perhaps you can answer the same question, Suresh Ji.
Right. Namaste and good evening to everyone. Just let me know as we approach 3 minutes so that I don't overrun or steal Alexi's time.
No
Right.
problem.
Okay. On the face of it, it may appear as there's a general notion that Hindus have 33 million gods, and then some with animal heads and bodies and that kind of thing. But when we really drill down to the deepest philosophy, what we call Upanishads, actually, from a Hindu perspective, God is not a being or a person. It's not a personality, but a principle of goodness. So from Hindu perspective, anything that is good, anything that is creative, anything that sustains, anything that protects is God. So that is first thing. So God is not separate from me, you, or anybody in Hindu sense, yeah, and is not someone different who created the world. Hindus or the Sanatana philosophy believes that everything is Brahman. Simply translated is energy. Everything is energy, and we are part of that energy. So when we talk about God or Godhood or divinity, the sole aim of Hindu is to discover that divinity, that goodness, that divine, the higher spirit, whatever you want to call it, that is within us, is to keep refining and refining until we reach that enlightenment. Because if you look at all the four Indic faiths, that's Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Sikhs, there is no notion of God in Buddhism even anywhere near to Christianity, or even the way normally people think that Hindus believe. There's no concept of God at all. It's all about self-realization. Now there are within, like you said, Alex, that there are very different schools of thought, even amongst Unitarian. There are 6 schools of thought within Hindu tradition. And one of those thought actually says self-realization without God. Yeah. So the God is a tool, so to speak, something to focus on, something to idealize with, something to copy and become one rather than follow one. That is the Hindu view.
Great. Thank you very much, Suresh. Yeah, that's within the 3 minutes. So if I can now turn to Alex for the second question. This is all to do with immortality, reincarnation, one life, or the continuance of one's life into another birth, if you like, reincarnation. Alex, would you like to give your thoughts on that, please?
Thank you. And could you also give me the 3-minute timing as well, please? In the scriptures that the Christians call the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, there's very little about an afterlife as such. In fact, the notion of a general afterlife or a resurrection seems to have come about from Zoroastrian influences, and that in the century or two before the life and times of Jesus. And for a Christian, the problem with resurrection, I use that word problem deliberately, is that, as Bishop David Jenkins, a former bishop of Bishop of Durham, said famously, the resurrection is not a conjuring trick with bones. Those are his words, not mine. Because we have to ask ourselves, what is the meaning of an afterlife? What is it for? And if it exists, in what way does it exist? Because would I be resurrected as my 10-year-old self, or my 20-year-old self, or would I still have some hairs that weren't grey? I don't know. Equally, the philosophical influences of Hellenism, of Greco-Roman philosophy that influenced Christianity in the later centuries, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries of the Christian era, brought in the idea of the immortality of the soul. And there's an uneven tension and I hope a positive tension, dialectic between those two notions. If St. Paul says in a famous passage, a Christian doesn't believe in the resurrection, his or her faith is in vain. But in the same chapter, Paul also says that there's a physical resurrection, sown a physical body, but is raised a spiritual body, which seems to suggest that there's something much more than just something that's about material, physical world. This is about a spiritual reality. Coming to the question of reincarnation, there's an interesting text in the Bible in which Jesus refers to John the Baptist, and he says to his followers, this is Jesus talking, if you, his people he's speaking to, are willing to accept it, John the Baptist is Elijah, the great prophet Elijah, who is to come. And that's often cited as one of the evidences that Jesus may have had a notion of reincarnation.
Right.
With reincarnation as a concept, I'd be open to that possibility. The question of whether, and that brings up the question of what our personalities are. Is the Alex Bradley of today the same Alex Bradley that existed 10 days ago, 10 years ago, or 30 years ago? And in that sense, we all change, we are all different.
Okay.
And that's something where I think there's some room for fruitful dialogue between the faiths, because as is said in the Christian scriptures, we will not be the same in any afterlife as we are in this life. Right. Famously, Jesus said, there's no marrying or giving in marriage in the kingdom of heaven, which is an interesting comment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Namely, heaven, or however you define that, won't be the same as this life. So that's a quick answer to that question.
Thank you, Alex. May I pose the same question to Suresh on immortality, reincarnation, one life, or continuation of one's life, please?
I think what we find that within two main school of thoughts, Abrahamic and Indic faith, on many of the things they are diagonally opposite to each other. Like, God as a being, whereas, Indian or Hindu view is totally different. Is a principle rather than a person. The same here goes for reincarnation. Like I mentioned in my previous talk earlier, that everything is energy. Soul is nothing but the energy, and consciousness exists within that energy. And we all know, even by modern science, that energy can't be destroyed. So when we die, so to speak, death, because there's no concept of death as such in Sanatana or Hindu tradition, just the body perishes. Yeah. But there is no such a thing as death as normally defined in English text. Yeah. So when one dies, the soul, the energy continues its journey. Yeah, because it can't be destroyed. It just manifests in different form. Now, Alex, you mentioned something very interesting, that will Alex be the same in 10 days time, next time, and whatnot thing, or was he the same person 10 days ago? Now, there are two schools of thoughts, and they both are equally valid within Hindu perspective. From Hindu perspective, that some believe that you reincarnate as your children. So your reincarnation is an ongoing, continuous process. That is one thing. But more established belief is that when, so to speak, body dies or perishes, you come back as a new human being. Yeah. Now, what kind of person you become, that depends, which is one of the core and underpinning principle of law of karma. So if I have done the good things, then I will have a better life or good life next time around. If I done the not so good things, then I will suffer the consequence. It's very much cause and effect. Again, God doesn't come into the whole thing at all. God doesn't play any role at all. The kind of life I have or don't have it is my own doing. We take the full responsibility for who we are and what we are. God, again, is only used as a source of inspiration and encouragement rather than someone you follow or you believe in as normal established belief. Now, can the law of karma and reincarnation be proven? The time and again this question haunts us. Can reincarnation be proven? Unlike other faiths, which just goes literally by the book, if it's not in the book, then it's not true. In Hindu tradition, we are very open-ended, like a British constitution. As things evolve, new laws are incorporated in the constitution. So we strongly believe, as it stands now, Lazy, Mark, and everybody, Alexei, right, that we believe in these two things, law of karma and reincarnation. However, having said that, these thousands and thousands of years old belief, if Alex, and when I say Alex, I don't literally mean you, if anybody can prove beyond reasonable doubt that reincarnation is mumbo jumbo and there's not such a thing as law of karma, Hindus will be the first one to dump it, if you can prove it. But we are that open. But unless and until you come up with a better theory that makes better sense, it doesn't matter whether what Bhagavad Gita says, or the Veda says, or the Purana says, or Upanishad says, if you can prove beyond reasonable doubt, right, that this is crap, so to speak, right, then we are quite happy to read. But until now, and we have several examples of reincarnation as well, and law of karma. If there was no such a thing as law of karma and reincarnation, then we all would be born equal. We all will have exactly the starting point. And yet we know, don't we, Alexei, there are some children, only 5, 6 years old, they hardly been to school, and yet they exhibit some talent that you can never imagine. That would take it 50, 60 years, anyone will. So there is something that makes us different starting point. And not only that one, even twins, they don't have exactly the same life. So there's something that we bring forward, even if we can't prove it in a scientific way, but in logical way, right? That reincarnation makes sense, and it's valid from our perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sureshji. If I may turn to the third question, which is about karma, which is what you sow is what you reap. So if I may give Alex 3 minutes again on that one, and then I'll turn to Sureshji to give a reply. Thank you.
Thank you again. Here, I think the key word is personal responsibility and choice. And this is one of the interesting philosophical dilemmas, I think, for all faiths and people of no faith. There is a school of thought in Christianity out of which many Unitarian chapels came, called Calvinism, which emphasizes the absolute sovereignty of God and says, as a corollary, that human beings can do nothing to save themselves. That in fact, and these are using words that Calvinists use, that humankind is utterly incapable of good in its own right, only by the grace of God. And worse still, from my point of view, that God has predestined that some people are saved and other people will not be saved. Now, there was a British monk called Pelagius who lived in the 4th century into the 5th century of this common era. And Pelagius said, actually, yes, he believed that God gives us grace, but he said, we have personal responsibility. And Unitarians and liberal Christians, those who count themselves as Unitarian Christians, would tend to follow Pelagius. But they would also point out that there are texts in the Bible which justify this. In particular, the book called the Book of James, where it says that faith without a good works is dead, and where Jesus himself in the Gospel of Luke is quoted as saying that a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree good fruit. So in the modern day, there is a kind of scientific determinism that says that that it's extreme, that we are entirely constrained by our genetic inheritance and by our upbringing, and therefore that it would seem to take away all notions of personal responsibility, where I think that the fruitful approach is to say that while there may be what I call a power for rightness, goodness, which I call God, for want of a better word, nonetheless, I still have a personal choice and a responsibility that goes with that choice. And in the famous words from the Hebrew scriptures, I have set before you good and bad, the life and death. Therefore, choose life that you and your descendants will live. And so, therefore, the aim is to say here, where is your responsibility? It's not with God or with your genetic inheritance or even your upbringing, important though those may be. Ultimately, from the Christian viewpoint, and my Christian viewpoint, others might disagree, you are given choice as a thinking, sentient being. And that to me is where I stand, in fact. That, and finally, and this is where I find it interesting, and I often say that if I hadn't come across Buddhism when I was a teenager, I wouldn't be a Christian, because I came across the Buddhist notion of karma in one particular book which influenced me enormously. But here's a quote from the Christian scriptures, Galatians chapter 6, St. Paul. God cannot be mocked. What you sow, you reap. In other words, the doctrine of karma, as I understand it, says you cannot escape what you have done. An action you have done or an action you have not performed will have consequences. So in that sense, I see my faith, my Christian faith, as being very close, if perhaps not the same, to an Eastern notion of karma. And I really find it hard to see the difference at times between the two.
Thank you very much, Alex. May I turn to Sureshji just to finish off with that particular question, which was karma, what you sow is what you reap. If you'd like to do a 3 minutes on that one, please.
Here we go again. Right. Again, in Indic faith, you are solely responsible for who and what you are. There is absolutely, excuse me, no escaping from the fact that you reap the benefits, or whatever you call it otherwise, of your action. That is absolutely, there is no way you can outsource your responsibility. In that sense, Hindus, in its true spirit, do not believe in grace of God as such. The reason is this, that if we subscribe to that idea that is all forgiving God, then people can get up to all sorts of bad things in the knowledge that one day I'll go back and ask for forgiveness. Yeah, so that option is simply not there. Now, like I mentioned earlier, cause and effect, or whatever you do, exactly, you benefit from it or otherwise. But the underlying important philosophy in the law of karma is this, which I'd like to share with you. Say, for example, a person is driving and you knock somebody down and that pedestrian gets killed. Yeah, that is first thing. In another scenario, right, a person out of revenge, anger, whatever it is, literally murders, kills somebody. Again, a killing has taken place. And then we take a third scenario where a soldier kills 20 or 30 or 100 enemies in a battle. Again, killing is much bigger, isn't it? So where does the law of karma fit into these things? Because killing is killing, full stop. Whether you accidentally kill somebody crossing the road, or out of anger, or to protect your nation, people, whatever you call it. So the most underlying thing, what makes it good karma or bad karma, so to speak, yeah, is your intention behind doing the things. So the murder is still there, the killing is still there, but so a person who has killed somebody while crossing the road, he or she might get only 5 years or 10 years suspended, that is, looking at all the other things. The person who willfully kills probably ends up, for the life. Yeah, because we don't have the capital punishment. Unless you are in US, then you get hanged as well. and it's amazing, isn't it, LHC, right? The soldier who kills 20, 100, 500 enemy people, he actually gets what you call, although I'm not familiar with all these terms, so please help me, like MBE or, the bravery award and things like that, isn't it? Yeah. So it's not just karma itself, but it's your intention that leads you to that thing that makes a very, very important thing. So, number one, there is no grace as such, because there is no concept of God as an external being or a person who has created the world. So there's no concept of, yeah. Now, having said that, this one will come to you as a surprise, that most Hindus, when something good happens, Lizzie, LXG, Indraji, is this. When something happens, they'll say, it's the grace of God. Now, that's very contradictory, isn't it? On one hand, you don't have a God as a being, the person as such, but the reason why we say is because of the grace of God. It's not because there is an external physical being or God as such, but it is simply to maintain our humility. Otherwise, our ego, our head becomes very big, and we become very, very arrogant. So when we offer something to the God's grace, but it's in that sense that we become a humble being rather than a being. Because every time Alex or Indra or anybody is successful, our head and ego gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually we think that we are God or we are invincible. Yeah. So when we say it because of the grace of God, it's simply to maintain that humility.
Okay. Sureshji,